Today I'm joined by Sebastian, and we are going to look at CI/CD for applications built with Wing and Winglang. Hey Sebastian, great to have you.
Hey, Johannes. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Before we kind of get and jump directly into the topic around Wing, Winglang, Wing Cloud, and all of that fancy stuff that you're currently working on, can you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit who you are and what you're actually doing for the AWS community?
Yes, sure. I'm Sebastian. I'm based in Hamburg. I'm an AWS hero for DevTools. I built the CDK for Terraform at HashiCorp, and nowadays I'm working together with Wing and also the cloud tooling space. And doing very active around the entire cloud tooling sector.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's kind of also how we met. So I think we are both two of around 12 DevTools heroes that we have, which is not that much. It's kind of one of the smallest categories. The security group is now a little bit smaller. I think they just launched. If you're interested to learn more about the heroes program that AWS has, we can offer some guidance here as well. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about something pretty cool. Something that I've been following since I started my cloud DevTools tool journey at the end. And this is Wing. Let's try to base that a little bit. What is Wing, Sebastian?
Well, Wing is like a programming language for the cloud. So it's based in the CDK ecosystem. So that's where it's stemming from. So which means it's like a high-level programming language that is trying to model the entire lifecycle of cloud applications, and it's doing this in the CDK ecosystem by leveraging CDK for Terraform. You can even use AWS CDK if you want. So it's very agnostic in terms of which engine you're using, but it's trying to abstract the higher-level constructs. So building upon the general idea of CDK. So they can have cloud resources, like a table, buckets, APIs, functions, stuff like this. And these can be specifically concrete implemented by, for an AWS provider, but in the end, essentially for any provider which you want. And so it's abstracting functionality, common functionality, and it's modeling pre-flight and in-flight functions or stages, which means the cycle before you actually deploy something, and then the cycle where you actually have deployed your stuff and you want to run your business logic. So we have a look at this, how this is actually going to look like. But that's in a nutshell what Wing is really about.
So it's a new programming language in a sense that abstracts cloud infrastructure and also abstracts the different parts that you need to build true native cloud native applications. That's the way that I see it, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yes. Yes, it's like a net new language. So you can still, include JavaScript functions if you want, JavaScript code, any npm package. But the actual language is not JavaScript in the end.
And going forward, we are hoping to also be able to support a lot of different cloud providers. So that would then hopefully also make it kind of cloud agnostic in that sense. Or is that not where you see the language going?
Yes, well, I think that you have to distinguish between the language itself and the SDK, which is being built. The language itself doesn't really know anything about any cloud provider, but the SDKs do know about this. And there's a Wing SDK, which has implementations for AWS, for Google, and for Azure. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is that you have when you take a bucket, for example, or a table, that you have an SDK bucket, which then is an abstract abstract definition of a bucket, and then it's being implemented for AWS specifically, for Google specifically, and for Azure specifically. But you as a developer, you don't really have to care about this, right? So for you, it doesn't really matter. So you have your interface, a bucket, and that's going to be working in any cloud provider and the local part as well. So that's something I actually forgot in the pitch, which is the local development experience. So you have to look at this when I do the demo, which enables local development. like fast cycles, fast iterations, and yeah.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting.
Yes.
I can see that this language might be changing a lot of the stuff that we see on the market today. I think both the SDK and the language itself are developed in open source, right? So people that are eager to
Oh, yes.
contribute, maybe we can talk about that at the end of the session. But before we kind of rush it to the end, let's just ask my question. My question always is, from a CI/CD perspective, a new language means a complete different set of tooling and a complete different world. Is that the correct understanding, or am I wrong?
No, like it's well, like while it's like a new language, and you have to pick up some new language constructs, yes. But in terms of like operations or like deploying this thing, it's actually it's just fitting in whatever you have. So for the main part, it's like the SDKs are built upon like based on Terraform, right? So that's the engine which is actually gonna do the deployment part. Which means, so whatever kind of system you're using at the moment, this is not really going to change, since you can take a Wing application and just compile it down to Terraform, like for the infrastructure part, and the business logic part is going to be compiled down to JavaScript, which means like you don't have to invent any new Lambda runtimes or anything. It's just going to work. And you can take the output of the compilation process and just run in Terraform apply, and that's all you need, really.
Okay, that sounds cool. That means I don't need to touch as much as I thought, right? But I can still enable developers to use that more modern language for cloud applications in that sense, right?
Exactly, yes. Yeah.
Cool. Then I would say, if you don't mind, let's just dive into an example. And as everyone that is watching this channel from time to time, I always try to see some code and also see some CI/CD pipelines here, right? So maybe we can start looking at at maybe something like how does Wing look like from a language perspective, so we get a sense of that, and then we can dive into do we have an example CI/CD pipeline that we could just use for applications based
Yes.
on
Yeah, sure.
Winglang? So let's share your screen and let's get going.
So here's like maybe I should render the README. Right, so we have like a little example application which is I took this from like the open source examples repository, so like a bunch of Wing examples, but it's like it's something there which has like a full website and some full cycle. So it's like a very simple application, but you can it's sufficient for like doing some demo, right? So that's like a Wing application. That's Wing code. You have your dependencies. And as you notice, that's really only SDK resources or like Wing resources. So there's not any external dependencies here in this case, at the moment at least. And we see like a website resource, an API resource, and some testing, right? We come to that in a second.
So just before we go there, from a Winglang perspective, we can see here that there is a main.w, which at the end means, that's the end of the.
That's
ending.
essentially the entry point, but it's not like a defined convention. It's so you have to provide the entry point to the CLI when you're synthesizing or when you're deploying anyway. Mm-hmm. But it's like a single entry point at the moment. Recently, and I think it was like up until recently, it was only possible to have one Wing file in a project. But like a few weeks ago, like multiple files, like some simple module support essentially got shipped, which means now you can break down your application into multiple files to organize your code and even share code, right? And like via some module or npm package or something.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
To the right-hand side, I just opened up the Wing extension, the Visual Studio Code extension, which is like a live representation of the code we are seeing here, right? So you can see here, like we have like our cloud API, which is this thing here. with 2 handlers, like a cloud website, which we saw above, and like a little counter, which is like a like a counter, which increment, decrement. And in AWS, it's going to be, I think it's going to be compiled to like a DynamoDB table to keep the state. But yeah, so like this, ignore this little core sender thing here. So there's like a pull request open, which I'm just working on to inline this to something like, like something like cause true, maybe. This will get rid of all the boilerplate setup for cores. So I think when this video is published, maybe that's already shipped. We will see. But yeah, so, and it's not only like a live representation, you can actually interact with this. So, right, so you can see, okay, that's like my counter resource. I can set the value, I can increment the value in theory. Maybe that's broken, I don't know. But in theory, I should be able, oops.
I can interact with the cloud representation model that I see on the right-hand side at the end, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's like the UX is like a bit off at the moment. Actually here. So it was working, it was just not able to see it. All right, so it's working, and I can reset this. I can invoke functions here if I want. And let's go to the website thing. Oops.
So this all comes out of Visual Studio Code extension that we have for Wing, as far as I understand, right? So this means an extension that I would need to install, and that will then enable.
No, you don't. Yeah, yes, the extension you have to install. You can do the same in like the actual via the CLI. I don't know why I can't interact with this API thing. Let's jump into the terminal and just use the CLI, right? Let's just do wing it. And then this will open, like, if you only have one Wing file, it will just default to use whatever Wing file you have. If you have like multiple files, you will have to choose the file you have there. To move this, and that was the control I was looking for. I'm not sure why the extension didn't show this. And that's the beautiful website we are seeing here, right? So it's like a static website with some interactivity. So we press a button and we increment some counter, right?
And this then kind of works locally in the background, started by.
This is all locally, exactly. Like Wing spins up like a local simulator, which will simulate all the resources, like the API, the counter. What else did we have here? And the website thing, right? So serve the website.
Cool.
So let's just have a quick look. Like it's really a static HTML thing with HTMX for the interactive part. So it's really simple.
Simple thing.
A simple thing, yes. So, but you get the idea. And here's the counter increment. So that's what we just pressed, right? So, and it's gonna just replace the HTML part. And of course, talking about like application is nice, but like how about CI/CD? And like one part or like one step to CI/CD is certainly testing. And we see we have like a few testing handlers here. And again, these are also working locally. Right, so you can just run them locally, and okay, they're pretty fast, and it obviously runs locally. But at the same time, you can is it this? I believe so. You can just change the target, which is like the platform you want to deploy at. And you can run the same test without changing anything against this, like the TF AWS target. TF stands for Terraform. And then it's actually going through the full cycle, right? So it's compiling this main Wing file to like an TF, like to a CDK TF thing, essentially. It's going to run the Terraform init part to fetch the providers. And then it's going to apply this. And then once it applies, it's running the tests, checking for the successful yes or no. And in any case, it's going to be destroyed again, right?
So does it deploy an ephemeral environment of your cloud application here, right?
Pretty much. In this case, actually, it's deploying one full environment per test, right? So it's going to deploy one environment for this and one environment for this. So they don't share any resources in the background. This is pretty cool on the one hand. On the other hand, you can imagine, depending on the resources you're deploying, this might not scale well. So we have to think about like how this actually, like how to find like something which is also scalable. So like there's like an open issue where we have like, I think like an example with 10 or 15 tests or something like this. And then each of these tests is spinning up an API gateway. You run into rate limit issues, maybe resource limit issues, so like all kinds of issues. But yeah, so like if it's only 2 or 3, then it's okay. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why you should think about this more of an actual integration test and not really like a full end-to-end test, not really like a unit test, right? So popping in like 100 tester won't work at the moment.
So is there a possibility to then define also unit tests before you actually go that kind of integration level test yet with Wing?
Essentially, that's like more or less like the local part, right? Local is pretty quick. Local is pretty quick. The issue is really you can't really differentiate between it or define I want to run this only locally at the moment. I think you could like essentially you could just fall back to I don't know if that makes sense. I was just thinking maybe to fall back to JavaScript, but I'm not really sure if that makes sense.
Let's not reinvent the way that we do testing here. I think let's look at what we have today. So essentially that means from a CI/CD perspective, if I want to deploy this out, I would be first running the tests locally. Once they pass, then I would be running them in an integration test perspective, right? Right now, Wing only gives the option to kind of run the same tests where the meaningfulness might not be that high, right? But going forward, if we can then differentiate between tests that I run locally and tests that I run on the cloud, right, of real life,
I mean, that would be cool. The idea is really like the local simulation, since like you're working with an SDK, like with an interface here, right? So by definition, the API has like a really just a small subset of features from, for example, like an AWS API gateway. But Wing, for this surface area of the API, Wing guarantees, okay, this behaves the same locally as it would be in AWS. So that's the rough idea, right? So like if the test is working locally, it should be working remotely as well.
Okay, that makes sense.
But yeah, other than that, it's like pretty much what you said, right? So it's, let me just move this picture here a bit away. So here's like should I just add this like this little workflow here, which represents what you just said, right? So like it's like in GitHub Actions workflow, which is going to run the local tests, like the simulator tests and the AWS tests in parallel. And so in this case, we don't really care about any state, since Wing will just tear down it anyway, right? So this is one of the reasons why we don't have to inject any state handling here for Terraform, for example.
Okay, and so this Wing takes care of setting up the environment at the end, right? Deploying it out, managing the Terraform state as well, and kind of deletes the Terraform state again afterwards at the end. Okay, cool.
So this, exactly. So this would be the testing part then, yes. So we see, okay, hey, apply finished, it's setting up the test runner, and the tests are executed remotely as well, right? So like they are invoked from local, but the test runners are actually running as a Lambda function in this case. And this makes it really easy. So hang on a second. And exactly, so here we see the part where it's going to be destroyed again, so we don't really have to think about state. That was the point.
Okay.
And if you want to continue, there are like GitHub Actions. So like, since state handling is like a bit difficult, right? So you need some S3 bucket or some other means to keep your state. Like similar, like various scenarios. So like
I'm
we
sorry,
build like
Sebastian.
yeah.
We need to pause for a second.
So yeah, as I said, like we built like a little GitHub action to streamline the AWS deployment or like the Wing deployment. And at the moment, I think we support S3 as a backend. Since like the way deployment works and like from the general idea is Wing doesn't really do deployment. So while we just saw that we do like testing and it's actually like doing all the testing steps, there's not really the same thing for like a Wing deploy command at the moment. And I think like one of the reasons really is that there's so many different ways to deploy this that it's really hard to abstract this away at the moment. However, we needed like just for our own purposes, essentially, we needed some way to easily deploy things, and we just defaulted to GitHub Actions, and that's why we built this little GitHub action, right? And one way to do this is with plugins, right? So with plugins, you can essentially change the compiled output of your application. So when we have a look here, maybe at the generated application, we didn't really compile anyway, right? Let's just compile this. And so we should see like a.
So we can at least see that the test's now completed with 8 minutes, 20 seconds or something like that.
Yes. And here's the target, right? So that's what we just compiled, the main.tf LOS target. And here's like the Terraform configuration, right? So like whoever saw Terraform, it's obviously not HTML. It's like a JSON format of this, which is the same, which is CDK for Terraform is using. But any other automation tool which is using Terraform is essentially mostly using the Terraform JSON format. And there's not really any state handling defined here, right? It's like local state, I believe, if at all. The local backend is defined here. And this is great for local use cases, like single developer just wants to try out some stuff. But for actual production deployments, this doesn't really cut it. And so like one option would be to just inject this here somehow. You could put in the CDK for Terraform dependency via npm, for example, and start to define your backend here. Or what's the better way is to use a plugin, right? So like when you compile things, you can define plugins. You can say, I need a plugin, whatever it is, and this is a JavaScript file, and you can hook into the lifecycle of the compilation process. So there's several stages, some validation stage, some I forgot the names actually, but have a look here, post and present, something like this, right? So the several hooks there can define or like change the configuration. That's what we're using for Terraform configuration to the backend. So we just inject like an S3 backend. That's what
this is then plugins for the Wing compiler at the end, right? So
exactly
for the Wing toolkit. Okay, yeah.
Exactly. We just say here it's like a backend S3.js thing. This file needs to be present in the repository, of course. And then you can just do whatever you want. And in like the Wing GitHub action is actually using this to define the backend for Terraform and S3. So we don't really want to have to deal with this. So what we are doing is we use this application as a Wing workflow, Wing GitHub action, copy it over, say deploy YAML, and paste it in. Let's just double check AWS region, TF backend bucket, AWS region, and the AWS role iron. So these are all secrets I defined before into the repository, but if you wouldn't have this, you would have to define these. And so what this GitHub action is relying on, like for credentials to hook up the GitHub repository to AWS, is GitHub OpenID Connect, right? So which means like the AWS account needs to be configured in a way that allows your repository to do certain actions.
Yep.
So there's probably like a full video about this somewhere. The alternative would be to use static credentials, but that's not really great. So yeah, I like this version much better.
And this one now would be executing Terraform plan only, right? So the example that we pasted in right now.
Exactly. I'm just stumbled upon this here. That's wrong. Let's use. Why is this wrong? I wanted to use a tech version, but I think you can also use main. That should be okay. Yes, and that's actually deploying this stuff, right? So when we commit this, so I haven't tested it before, but let's see.
There's something wrong in the GitHub action, I think.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think it's just a linter, which is off for some reason. So it says, okay, it might not be available. Yes, true. If it's a secret, it might not be available.
And the 9x838, the GitHub token that you're passing down there?
Because this should be present.
Okay.
This should be present. But I think we don't need this for deployment anyway.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. Because it uses OpenID Connect, it should not need the GitHub token.
That's so I copied this from the deploy action, and I just made a mental note to update this since it's wrong. So it's using pull request diff, which is like a other
another action that we have.
Another action, and it's mixed up.
Happens. Okay. Anyway, this is why it's open source. So everyone looking at this,
yes,
please contribute to it as well. Right. So now the moment that you push this, it would be automatically directly executing it as well, and it should then deploy out that website with the little API that we saw.
In theory, this could be okay.
Let's see.
Wow. Not sure what that was. The GitHub token was removed. So let's see what this is doing. If there are like any errors in these actions. So this is not running. The SDK tests are running. Okay, but why is the deployment not running? Was there like another error? This looks like a bit.
It's on pull request. We need to remove that to be on push at the end.
Good point.
Yeah, that's because we copied that wrong example.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Well, it's not. Essentially, it proves the Johannes doesn't do much edits thing that I've been talking about with you at front, right? So
yeah. So we can just update this.
And now we haven't speeded up that commit message here. That Sebastian was really typing that fast.
Yes. And there we go with the deployment. And let's see. So this is, pulling the correct GitHub action, and then it just should do the thing. Oh, errors region was not applied.
Maybe a secret is not set up in that repository.
Yeah, maybe. Let's just use this. And there's the other region.
There's the other region.
Let's just double check the region. So why? Indeed. So then what about the tests, by the way? Are they working?
I think they should be still running, right? Yeah.
So the simulator was working, yeah, and the other part is still ongoing.
As we saw earlier, it's going to take at least 5 or 6
I think
minutes.
in like a real, like in a real setup, what you probably want to do is to run these tests first and then configure the other workload to be dependent on the output of this somehow. Since at the moment the GitHub action is not performing tests, right? It's really solely focused on deploying or like creating diffs.
And that's what I would wish as a developer using Winglang, right? Or Wing would be getting a little more guidance on how to actually do that with some examples that we can directly interact with at the end, right? That would be.
Yeah. What do you mean by examples? For what? For deploying or for?
Yeah, best practice CI/CD pipeline that we could directly use, right? That would be kind of the awesome stuff.
So I mean, there are like a few examples, right? So like a few examples. There's like this examples repository, for example, which is doing also like full integration testing for all the examples here. And like there are like a few of them. So there's some copy and pasteable thing around deployments. I think it's really, again, like like the deployment part. Like if we wouldn't use the GitHub action, what we would do is like we did the compile. So we compile this thing. So that's more or less what the GitHub action is doing, right? So it's compiling this thing. It's changing into the output directory of this, and then you can just run Terraform init, no magic.
Cool.
It will just work. And then once that's done, you can do like a plan or like a imply or whatever you want it to do. Like the only like GitHub Actions really just streamlining this like a bit, checking for npm dependencies, injecting the backend which we talked about, like for state handling, and then it's really deploying, just running Terraform apply, and that's more or less this. Which means any Terraform example which is out there is still valid for Wing deployments using some provider based on Terraform.
With that one additional thing that we would need to execute Wing compile first, and then we could use the output of that to run our Terraform steps, right? At the end. Because so if I
yes, sure. You need to compile, and then put it somewhere. Like it depends on what kind of workflow you have, what kind of tool you're using. Some people, for example, when I remember from talking to CDK for Terraform people, customers, some people there were just committing the compiled artifact of something like CDK for Terraform to their repository, and then kick off their whatever they have, right? So
CD
based on Terraform
or whatever. Yeah.
So which means like if you have some pre-process step which compiles, commit to the repository, and then use whatever Terraform tool is out there. Okay. Totally valid.
Okay, great, cool. So then we would.
So it looks like it's actually deploying, even though the Terraform plan is written there. But this seems to work. So it's like this mix up from earlier.
Yeah, that's just the wrong name at the end,
It's
right?
just the wrong name, yes. So we use the right action, so it's deploying, so it's working. And then here's the bucket, which then will contain the state. Right, so it's like just saving the state there in a state file.
Cool.
And yeah, so that's.
And that's the state file that I can then this GitHub action will then also use going forward. So every time that I deploy something through that action, it's going to refer to that state file. That means that that's the pieces that I need, right? So
Exactly. And there's also the pull request diff action, which is also, so the naming is like just a convention. So like based on the organization in GitHub, the repository name, the branch, and then based on this convention, the pull request diff action is able to do like a diff from the pull request against main and say, okay, hey, if you would merge this pull request, this would happen, right? That's the diff which we see, to the main state file.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Then let's conclude our coding piece and our look at the pipeline itself, and let's move over once again to stop sharing your screen, and then we can do some kind of wrap up.
Yes.
So I would start off with a question around having that Wing compiler from a development perspective, developer experience perspective, sounds like a chance to include stuff like security scanning and secrets verification and stuff like that directly within the compiler, which then avoids that the Terraform code actually has security vulnerabilities. Is that built in already, or is this something where you know that the team is thinking of including that going forward?
Well, security scanning in that sense, I'm not aware of. That's not there at the moment, but it's certainly like baked in best practices around security definitions. So like the compiler, like when you remember like the API counter, the API construct, the counter, the API handlers. So all of these were deployed to AWS, and we didn't talk about like permissions at all, right? Mm-hmm. So since the compiler is actually recognizing, okay, I have like a counter resource, and this function is talking to this, and the counter is actually like a dynamic table. So what needs to happen, right? So you need like some permission, and it's defaulting to least privilege. So which means like if you only need to put a value to that table, then you only get the put value, like the put permission to that table for that handler, right? So it's like that's sorted out automatically without you having to think about this at all. And of course, like there are like ongoing, I don't know, like updates. What was it, like the bucket handling for public permission, stuff like this? Like sometimes a huge pain when something is changing. AWS is not changing often, but when it's changing, that might be really painful. Mm-hmm. And so this is just going to be abstracted away by SDK resources.
Okay,
right?
Well, that's already very kind of helpful as well, right? I think what the compiler can also help us with is really making sure that we follow those best practices going forward, right? And if in that kind of, let's say, workflow that you have with the simulation at the end, developer workflow that you have with simulation, testing out locally, then running integrations tests and stuff like that, right? We can bake in things like best practices that we are asking from other, let's say, cloud providers that we don't have today, right? And that would be something where I can see Wing coming up as powerful as well from a CI/CD perspective, right? And giving us an input here as well, like rendering out a GitHub Actions through the compiler or through the CLI, right? That would be following all of those best practices, could empower developers at the end to build up better CI/CD pipelines at the end.
Yeah, true. I mean, this is like a bit overlapping with Progen or like similar tools, right? So you could have like a Progen thing which renders down your GitHub workflow for this. But yeah, like I think in particular on this like getting started experience, there's like something, or like there's like lots of things which we certainly think about. For example, if you wouldn't really want to use like a GitHub action since you're using something else, but you still want to you have to put your state somewhere, right? And So we thought about maybe having some bootstrapping thing, that just takes care that all the things are wired together correctly, set up correctly, like in Bucket, for example, permissions and all this stuff. And yeah, like in the end, like something like workflows could fit in there as well. But I mean, there's so many different things. Yeah, it's something to see. But yeah, I think it's really important to nail the initial experience, right? So like have a simple application and then being able to push this to live without really having to think about this would be really, really valuable. Yes.
I agree to that. My challenge here is that this is already easy with existing frameworks that we have, right? And that especially people like me, if I start playing around with private projects, I tend to forget all of the pieces that make cloud applications reliable and secure at the end, right? And that's where I'm hoping that new framing tools like Wing, like Pulumi, like Cloto,
beyond day one experience.
That's exactly, that help us get better at that, right? So if you could take that back to the Wing team as best wishes, what I personally would like to get, that would be cool, right? To make sure that that developer experience doesn't end with the developer, right? It needs to include that piece of the ops that we always talk about, right? When we talk about DevOps, right? It's not just developer experience; it has that operational piece as well, right?
Of course. And I think that's where Wing really nicely fits into this picture, right? So since like with like building a Wing application, so like the language and the SDKs, they're really doing like a good job to abstract this away and to present like a nice interface for like developers. But at the same time, you can when you're like more concerned about operations, you can still use something like like the plugins, for example, which are working today, right? To maybe define like some things which you think like what makes a bucket compliant in our organization. What about tables? You can like essentially fine tune the resources. Like a bit difficult at the moment, but I think there's more coming on that angle. So that makes it easier to define your own organization internal platform thingy somehow. So define like how resources are behaving there without having to tell each and every developer every week what updated and why you have to use that encryption and not that, and like all the little nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, that sounds like still a great journey where you're going with Wing. Like, so where can people follow that journey and maybe collaborate as well and give their input?
That's Winglang.io. And like all the stuff we're talking about is all open source, right? So it's like you can just go to Winglang.io. You will find documentation, the GitHub repositories. There's a Slack channel, like a Slack community, where like all people are hanging around, and also like all the open source contributors and the entire community. So if there are any questions, just ping in the Slack channel. That's probably the best choice. And other than that, like creating issues in the repository is also a good idea if you come across something. And there's like one thing I totally forgot. There's also like a live web-based playground, so you don't even have to install anything. You can just go to winglang.io, and there's like a playground. We can just play around with the resources. It's essentially like the local simulator in the web browser, cool. And so this is easy to get started.
Yeah, I would encourage viewers to try that out and gain some experiences with Wing, which is kind of really a more modern-based cloud application development language, right? Really looking forward to see what we are going to see developing here. I met a few of the teammates behind Wing, and I think it's going to be amazing what we see there. Going back to you personally, Sebastian, where can people find you and where can they follow you or maybe ask you some advanced questions?
Well, I'm certainly also in the Slack channel I just mentioned. And other than that, well, not really active on Twitter anymore due to reasons. And yeah, I think the best shot is at the moment is LinkedIn.
Okay.
That's where I'm usually quite responsible as well.
Going to make sure that I link that in the show notes as well. And with that, as I anticipated, it did not take us 20 minutes. It took us 44 minutes, Sebastian. Thank you so much for your time. This was really invaluable. I learned a lot about Wing and how to use it. And I'm definitely going to give it another try, as I think there's a lot of stuff coming from the team. Yeah, thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Talk to you soon, Sebastian. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.